Well, good morning if you are watching this on the west coast of the United States or South America, somewhere in the Pacific. Good afternoon if you are in Nebraska or Philadelphia or New Haven, Connecticut or Boston or even New York City. Good evening if you are in the Scottish Highlands, if you are in Norway, if you are somewhere in Italy or Africa, or really anywhere in the world where people see Fred Plotkin on Fridays on Adagio. Welcome. I'm Fred Plotkin. Adagio, as you know, is the place where classical music happens. It's a video and audio streaming platform dedicated to supporting artists and to making classical music and opera available to music lovers all around the world. Today is July 5th of 2024. I'm very happy to have today's guest. She's someone we know each other in passing, I would say. I wrote the program notes for one of the operas that she composed. She, and her name is Missy Mazzoli, is one of our greatest composers. I'm going to say that unabashedly and without any attempt to be objective. She wrote an opera called Breaking the Waves, which is spectacular. And anytime someone says to me there are no good modern operas, there certainly are. And at the top of my list, along with a couple of others, is Breaking the Waves. So I wore a shirt that has waves on it, Missy, for you. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for being here. Now, I was going through a lot of your compositions, and actually I should have written this question down, but I know it from memory. One of your operas is referred to as a micro opera, A Flourish of Green, and another one, Salt, is called a mini opera. What is the difference between a micro opera and a mini opera?
I don't know. I wrote A Flourish of Green when I was composer in residence at Opera Philadelphia, and was just a really short piece for students at Curtis, and Salt was just for cello and electronics and voice.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess mini in scope.
You didn't want to call it a pinch of salt.
No.
So let's go really right to Breaking the Waves, because I think it's just everything an opera can and should be. I rank it up with all the operas, the great operas have been written throughout the history of the art form. And it's based, I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, on a film by Lars von Trier that starred Emily Watson in her first film role, I believe, and Stellan Skarsgård. It's set in and near Scotland and Norway. And take it from there.
Yeah, so yes, as you mentioned, this is based on the 1996 film by Lars von Trier, and it follows the story of a fictional story, thank God, of Bess McNeil, who is a very devout young woman in her early 20s, as you said, living in the Scottish Highlands. We in the opera we sort of really firmly placed it in the Isle of Skye, and in the movie it's more ambiguous. And she falls madly in love with Jan Nyman, who is an oil rig worker, and she asks the church for permission to marry this outsider, and the church grants her permission. And they have a few months, weeks, unclear, of wedded bliss, and then Jan is tragically injured, and he's paralyzed. He's injured in an accident on the rig, and he's paralyzed from the neck down. And so Bess, comes to believe through a series of events, comes to believe that she has the power to heal Jan by being with other men and telling him about it. And the way that this comes about is really ingenious on von Trier's part. Bess is surrounded by people telling her what to do. Her mother is telling her what to do. The church, she has these amazing conversations with God, and God is telling her what to do. And her sister-in-law is telling her what to do. The doctor's telling her what to do. They're all telling her different things. And she's left with her own version of morality and goodness and her own path, which is, and I love this movie and the story, because it's not clear that we're supposed to be rooting for her. I mean, she's obviously on this path to destruction, but yet she's the hero. And
Self-destruction.
Self-destruction, yeah, and destruction at sort of just the hands of the society that she's in, and but I really related to that as a woman. You know, I felt that when I saw Breaking the Waves, I thought this is the story of a woman in an impossible situation, you know, and this feeling of having everyone telling you what to do, but they're all telling you different things is very familiar to me. And this idea that there's no path of behavior that's going to make everybody happy was really familiar. And so Breaking the Waves is about a lot of different things, but it's, you know, that to me was central among its themes and one of the things that I wanted to bring out in the opera. Um, and you know, yeah, so I see it. I wouldn't call it a feminist movie. I think that that's too black and white to sort of label it that way. But it, I really related to that theme within it. In addition to the themes about, you know, what is the nature, what does it mean to be a good person? What is the nature of faith? What is the nature of loyalty? Again, when you're hit with all these different conflicting desires and needs from the community around you.
Are there any other opera characters our audience might know that you saw in Bess in terms of her dilemma, her challenges, or the way people treated her?
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of, I think that there, I found a lot of resonance in Peter Grimes. You know, this is the story of an outsider in a, you know, a UK like fishing village.
Hmm.
um, they're both, um, you know, have that similarity, and it's not clear the path of behavior for Peter. You know, that what path would make everybody in the town happy with him. He's sort of doomed from the outset, and I think that Bess has a similar story.
I found Lucia di Lammermoor in her in a big way, uh,
Okay.
in part because it was Scotland, but that's really coincidental. But more that here was a woman who did what she wanted to do for love, but
Hmm.
one could say was nearly crushed or attempted to be crushed or was crushed um, by all the outside forces who, quote, knew better, whether
Hmm.
it was her brother, whether it was the man she loved, whether it was her attendant, Eliza, whether it was the Raimondo, the advisor, the religious figure. And it made her, again, we could say it made her crazy, it made her angry, whatever term we want to use for the madness of Lucia. But
Hmm.
I didn't see in Bess, quote, a mad scene, and I was not looking for it. But nonetheless, I felt very deeply the Scottish rootedness, Rootednes, the sense of confinement, the
Hmm.
sense of very few options for a woman.
Hmm.
And, but I have to add something that part of why I'm so admiring of this opera and your work is I was a very close friend of the actor Christopher Reeve.
Okay.
We did a lot of stuff together, not artistically. We did one thing artistically, but we did a lot of stuff politically. He was a very engaged person, and we shared those values. And Chris had this terrible riding accident
Hmm.
and was paralyzed. I knew his wife somewhat, but not too much. So it's not that I saw in her Bess.
Hmm.
His relationship to his disastrous injury was not unlike Jan in certain ways,
Hmm.
that he wanted other people to keep living, and Chris was willing to fight for it, but I think he was willing to fight for the research on spinal injuries for other people. I'm guessing, I don't think he knew or believed that he would be cured, but
Hmm.
nonetheless, he felt that his body, his situation had to be part of the fight to make things better for others. That was the man I knew.
Hmm.
And so I won't say that I saw in Jan Christopher Reeve, but I deeply understood how a vital, handsome, uh, charismatic man who is suddenly laid low and is entirely dependent on the ministrations of others could be a powerful, dramatic figure.
Hmm.
So while Bess is definitely the core of the opera, he to me was not a secondary character. He was not a device. He
Hmm.
was a driving part of the plot as well.
Yeah.
And that's what made it so exciting as an opera, not as a story, because you had two very strong characters, not one. And there were two people that we could like and admire and care about. there are many operas in which the two leads are unlikable. To me, these two characters were, in their profound tragedy and humanity, incredibly likable. They were people I cared about deeply, the two of them. And I will say, too, I saw it in Philadelphia. It had a spectacular production. And it had, her name was Kira Duffy, I believe,
Yes.
just an absolutely magnificent, courageous, although we don't have to use that word in opera because you all have to be courageous, but courageous performance as best by Kira Duffy that just was mind blowing. And I think about it all these years later because it was that good. And so I never had the chance, apart from telling you that I thought it was great, to tell you why and how deeply it affected me and affects me still.
Oh,
So,
thank you. Yeah, and
but
I just want to shout out our director, James Dara, was
yes,
the original director for that, and John Moore was Jan in that original production.
yes. And I know, and you know, that opera doesn't just happen. I would love to know, once you had this idea, how it grew into an opera. I know who did the libretto, but I'd rather you talk about him, and how that collaboration went from your initial idea to the production that I saw on the stage.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so Breaking the Waves, my librettist Royce Vavrick, who I've worked with on all of my operas, he initially suggested it, and I was at first pretty hesitant to take this on as an opera, just because I felt I loved the film, and I really wanted to get it right. And this was only my second opera. My first opera, Song from the Uproar, was essentially a monodrama and was a much smaller scale. So I was like, this is a story that requires a big format, and it requires all the stops. And I really want to get this right. And after a while, I just thought, I just kind of decided to go for it. It was an idea that wouldn't leave me alone. And so we just decided to do it. And I was at that time, composer in residence with Opera Philadelphia, and they were very open in wanting to do it.
And so Royce proposed it. It's a gorgeous libretto. How did the process work in the case of the creation of this opera? Did he finish the libretto and bring it to you? Did you start with him at the beginning? Because people don't know how opera comes to be born.
Yeah, so the words always come first for us in our collaboration. He finished a complete libretto, and then we had extensive workshops on it. That's sort of one of the dreamy things about opera, is that you get to workshop things. And we were going back and forth on the text a lot, working with James, trying things out. And so there was a lot of back and forth. Also with our dramaturgs, we had two dramaturgs, Corey Ellison and Mike Cohen, and they were extremely helpful as we were in the workshops, like shaping the drama, and it had a real impact on the piece.
Corey and I are old friends. Explain how a dramaturg has an impact on an opera, in the developments of an opera, of a new
Yeah,
one. Yeah.
yeah. So Corey's job and Mike's job was really to just, make sure that the story is being told in a sort of taut and interesting way that has forward momentum. And if since I'm writing the music and Royce is writing the text, it's like it's easy to get sort of in the weeds and not see the big picture. And one of the dramaturg's jobs is to keep their eyes on the big picture. And if there are any loose ends, it all of a sudden, like, we've made some edits and all of a sudden it doesn't make any sense. Like their job is to sort of call it out. And the great thing about working with Corey is that she also has such an extensive knowledge of opera that she was able to reference things and recommend scenes that we could study as a sort of to get to what we were trying to go for in Breaking the Waves. And the great thing about Mike was that he had never seen the film. So, we expected that like about half of our audience would have seen the film and half of our audience wouldn't. So to have a dramaturg who hadn't yet seen the film and who was just reacting to it as, that this was the first way he was taking in the story was really helpful.
There was recently an opera done at the Met called The Hours
Mhm.
that was based on a book by Michael Cunningham that was then became a film, very famous, with Oscar-winning Nicole Kidman and Julianne Moore and Meryl Streep and Ed Harris. And then it became an opera with Renee Fleming in the Meryl Streep role, Joyce DiDonato in the Nicole Kidman role, and Kelly O'Hara in the Julianne Moore role.
Mhm.
The book, The Hours, was based on or inspired by the book Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf. And the reason I bring that up as an example is not to assess that opera, which I enjoyed, but because some people know the book Mrs. Dalloway, some people know the book The Hours, some people know the movie. Some people entered the opera house not knowing any of those and not necessarily knowing the references and the inspiration of Virginia Woolf, the author, Virginia Woolf, the character in the opera, Nicole Kidman, Joyce Donato. It can be complicated on many levels. And a dramaturg would have to enter that situation and clarify that we're in an opera house now. We're not telling the story of the film, the book by Michael Cunningham, or the original book by Virginia Woolf. I mention this because um, it's a challenge as a creative artist to bear in mind that you're drawing inspiration from other works and perhaps trying to tell the same or similar story, but with the knowledge that some people knew other iterations of the story. Not so much in Breaking the Waves,
Right.
but certainly a film, book, etc., by the Hours and of Mrs. Dalloway. Did you feel that burden at all in terms of knowing that some people will have seen the film, and which was a very visual film, a very intense film, because so much was focused on Emily Watson and close-ups as the actress? Or did you cast that aside, having had the initial inspiration, and then went to create an opera?
Um, we set out to create something that was intentionally very different from the film. So there isn't, for example, there's no like, well, I mean, future productions could have this, but the initial production didn't have much video in it. There were some beautiful projections by Adam Larson, but in general, we decided it would bring it too much back to the film to have like video on stage or like live camera feeds. Um, and just emotionally, I think from the first moment of the opera, you know that you're in a different world from the film. I think that the film, um, as I said, I love it, but it's confined by the fact that it's a film, and you can't, there's the classic thing in theater that in theater people can look anywhere on stage, and in film, you're being told where to look. So that is an advantage and a disadvantage to both genres. And so yeah, I think that and I think I was able in the opera to create many more emotional and psychological layers than are in the film. At my disposal I have, the action on the stage, the musical score, the text, the way that characters are standing around each other, like looking at what's going on in the corner of a stage while someone's singing. And so all of these things were tools that I used to sort of bring out the inner psychology of the characters. And I don't think that Von Trier had access to that, just because it's a film. It's just different.
When I try to turn people onto opera, which happens about 30 times a day, I often talk to them. I try to find their way in,
Mhm.
whether they love the theater, whether they love symphonic or orchestral music, whether they love song, whether they love dance, or whether they love film. And I always
Mhm.
tell them that film is the 20th century or late 19th century outgrowth of opera, and that opera is the product of all the previous art forms I named. But then film turns opera around because it's primarily visual and words, whereas opera, and people disagree with me when that's okay, is primarily music. And that
Mhm.
the story is told in music first with a libretto and with a stage production. But as you said, in an opera house, people can look anywhere, whereas in the film, someone decides what you see. So opera on video, whether in HD or earlier opera films, someone has made the decision of what you see and for how long you will see either the person singing or the other person reacting in shock to what that person, the first person singing about. Um, Whether something is in a close up, in other words, I use binoculars a lot when I go to the opera, not in a small theater where I saw Breaking the Waves, but in larger theaters, I certainly do. Um, but I think primarily for opera, I have to teach people the art of listening.
Hmm.
And we listen to the music, we listen to the words. But I encourage people actively with all art and also with eating food to not analyze as you're in the middle of experiencing it, but simply to see, to hear, to listen carefully, and after come out with your conclusions and your what you experienced in it. And that runs counter to the way a lot of people perceive art in our world, not just America, but everywhere, and where we feel we have to analyze. I've been asked countless times to be a critic, and I won't do that as a reviewer. And I won't do that because I don't want to be put in the position of analyzing something that I want to experience. And part of what I love in your music, again, I'm being unabashed, is after the fact, I feel very enriched by what I've heard. And doesn't always happen with all contemporary composers or even older composers, but certainly not with contemporary composers. And so this leads to a big and little question at the same time. Do you have and do you hear your composer's voice, and do you have just one voice as a composer, or are there many?
Um, I think there are many things that combine to form a voice. I'm especially in dramatic work, I'm always responding to what the drama requires. What does the moment require? What does the character require in that moment? And so, and that leads me into a lot of different places. Every opera is its own world. Every opera has its own mini language for that particular piece and its own collection of motives. And so. Uh, yeah, I think that if you look back, there are common threads in a lot of my work. I'm very focused on harmony and these sort of rich, dense harmonies that are always kind of shifting. And I'm very interested in electronic music. I'm very interested in a sort of bitonal interplay between major and minor, and different, sort of different keys happening at the same time. But, I don't really think about that so much when I'm writing. All of that kind of just stuck in my subconscious, and it comes out, but I'm not going to say, oh, I'm going to modulate to this related key here. It's just like, well, what does the character need there? And this goes for music without text too. It's like, what does this moment require from this piece and this arc?
That was my convenient way of transitioning to the next opera I want to talk to you about, which is called The Listeners.
Hmm.
Um, I've not seen it nor heard it nor even read the score. And I know it's a recent opera from 2021. It premiered in Norway, if I'm correct, and is coming to Philadelphia and Chicago. Has it been in Philadelphia? I'm not up to date.
It's coming this fall, so it's end of September in Philadelphia, and then March and April at Chicago Lyric Opera of 2025.
So I know literally nothing about it but the title. And
Okay.
therefore, but except that as someone who loves to listen as opposed to hear, I like hearing, but I love listening, that already has drawn me in. Could you tell us about what this opera is and how, again, where the inspiration came from and anything you want to tell me?
Sure. So, the Listeners is based on an original story by the Canadian writer Jordan Tannehill, who's most famous for his plays, novels, and is writing for TV. And so, Royce, my librettist, and I, at the time, we were really trying to move away from doing so many adaptations. Breaking the Waves is an adaptation. Our third opera together, Proving Up, is an adaptation of a short story. And I thought, it can't be opera's greatest destiny to tell stories that have already been told. I love doing adaptations. So much of the classic rep in opera is an adaptation of something that was once a play or a short story or a novel, and now the opera is more famous.
Hmm.
But you know, but I just wanted to try to find a story that had to sing in its first incarnation. So we went to Jordan and kind of posed that challenge to him. It's like we're like, you've written novels, you've written plays, you've written whatever, and but what would you do knowing that this would be an opera first? And he came to us with a bunch of different ideas, and one of them was a little 3-paragraph summary that became the opera The Listeners. And so The Listeners, it's a fictional story. It takes place at the present day in an American Southwest suburb. I always picture like a suburb of Vegas or LA, and it follows a school teacher named Claire Devon, who is leading a sort of relatively normal life. She has a kid, a 15-year-old daughter, Ashley, who plays soccer. She has a husband. She has a great house. She has a nice job. But she starts to be plagued by a humming sound that plagues her day and night. She can't get rid of this sound. And she tries everything, but it's really ruining her life. She loses her job. It's messing with her family life. It threatens to break up her marriage, and she's kind of at her wit's end. And then her student contacts her and says, I hear this sound too. And I also have found a self-help group in town for people who hear the hum. So end of Act 1, she goes to this meeting at the home of this very charismatic older man named Howard Bard, and meets other people who are experiencing this phenomenon of the hum. So fast forward to Act 2, and the group takes on sort of cult-like dimensions, and it's very clear that the leader, Howard, is really taking advantage of people and preying on their vulnerabilities. And halfway through the second act, it's revealed that he doesn't even hear it. He's a fraud. So when the group members find this out, they really turn on him. And I won't tell you how it ends,
Hmm.
but it's a very surprising ending, and it's very dramatic. And I think that I love this story because, number one, it's sonic. You have this sonic element of the hum, which the audience does hear at 3 points in the opera. And you also, it's really about the role of charismatic leaders in our society, and like at what points in history do we find ourselves turning towards more extreme, albeit charismatic people. And how do they take advantage of us at times when we feel lonely or lost or without community? I think one of the other themes in the opera is the sort of question of what happens to female ambition when it is suppressed and not seen. I think this main character, Claire, who was played by the amazing soprano Nicole Heaston when we did this in
Hmm.
Oslo in 2022, and she'll
She's been
also
on this
sing.
show. I love her. Yeah.
Yeah, love her. And she'll be playing the role of Claire in Philadelphia and Chicago as well. So
Good.
I really wrote it for her. And so this character Claire, her destiny is to be something huge and to be a leader. And she's kind of made all these decisions and sort of been encouraged, by society to sort of shrink those ambitions. And we decided that, when characters in the world of the opera are not paying attention to their true destiny, that is when the hum comes for you. That is when this phenomenon comes for you and won't leave you alone until you face what you've been unwilling to face. So every character who's in this cult, it becomes a cult, has something in their life that they're not willing to look at or face. And for Claire, it's this true destiny that she has to be a leader and do something really wild. So I was very interested in that. It's kind of a character based on my own mother, who always wanted to be an architect and had all these big dreams, and has had I think a good life, but there was always something sort of just beyond her reach. And I really wanted to create a female character in opera who was familiar to us, suburban mom who's a teacher, but who was searching for something again that was just sort of eluding her.
Is this character unique or typical in your view of American society, or is she someone that we can find in other societies in the world?
Well, I think that like so many things in life, everything is more extreme in America, or most things are very politically and socially uh, develop in a very extreme way in this country. But I think it's a universal phenomenon. This
Hmm.
idea of number one, like not truly facing your true destiny or your potential, and then particularly for women who are often not encouraged to do that. But also the powerful sway of charismatic leaders is something that countries all over the world are dealing with right now.
Right.
Um, and I think the message of the opera, we're not saying, oh, look at these people who got suckered into this cult. I approach it with great empathy and with what I hope and think is great understanding for why someone would be drawn to that. I mean, I was doing all this research as I was writing this opera on cults, particularly mostly in America, but around the world. And at the time when I was writing it, so this is like 2019, 2020, there were all these amazing documentaries. So Wild Wild Country, Going Clear, the movie about Scientology. There's a great movie called Holy Hell about a cult. And so it was really in the zeitgeist. And I found myself really not wanting to be in a cult, but really understanding why all these people were drawn to it. I mean, there are people whose parents kicked them out of their house because they were gay. There are people who just felt lonely and moved to a new place and were really without community, and then found this welcoming, accepting, unconditional love through these organizations. And everyone wants that. I would say like most people, everyone I've ever met wants that, including myself. So it's really, I don't set out to create operas that have a clear good guy and a bad guy. Everything is very, I'm interested in creating narratives that are more complicated,
Hmm.
and expressing narratives that are more complicated. So, yeah, so I'm really happy with the way this turned out. And the funny thing is, we set out to not do an adaptation and didn't. This was an original story, but it has since been adapted into a novel and is being made into a TV show on BBC Three coming out this fall, starring Rebecca Hall as Claire Devon.
Wow. Wow.
And the
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 daughter of an
reason,
opera singer,
right? Yeah,
Maria Ewing and Sir Peter Hall.
yeah,
Yep.
yeah. And I should say that the novel, Jordan wrote the novel and did I think wrote a lot of the TV series as well. And the novel, all three are very different. They all have
Hmm.
slightly different endings. The way that the characters are portrayed is very different, not just because of the different genres, but just in general. That we really kind of, it's like we all started from the same place, but then went in three different directions for it, which I think is great. And I
Yep.
wish. I think each genre requires something different dramatically. So I think it's very
Yeah,
exciting.
Gluck's production or Gluck's interpretation of Orpheus and Eurydice has different endings,
Hmm.
and producers can decide which ending they would prefer. So I'm okay with that. Um, I happen to be a huge, huge lover of the opera, and it is an opera, Tommy by The Who. There is currently a production in New York in its last weeks. It's not a perfect production, but it's a really good production with an excellent cast, and I would encourage people to see it. And it too is about cults in a way, but it's also about belonging to society or not belonging to society, with the addition of deafness for one of the characters and the lead character, Tommy, and how when he breaks out of the deafness and the blindness and the inability to speak, um, suddenly feels self-empowered and creates a cult and finds that in fact people have worshipped him in cult form. In certain productions, you have figures like Marilyn Monroe were brought in as cult icons. You have drug use, which is a different kind of either abandonment or seeking of enlightenment of the human experience, um, all of which is embodied in magnificent music. And in your telling of the story of the listeners, it immediately brought to mind Tommy. I'm not saying that you had that in mind, but I'm always fascinated by operas that have people who can't hear, or obviously the story of Beethoven, who was deaf most of his life, and how music is experienced by people and by language is how experienced by people who cannot hear.
Mhm.
Because there are deaf people who love their world and look on the hearing world as less rich and less complex and less emotional and less spiritual than the world of people who cannot hear. Um, I love in the opera Francesca da Rimini by Zandonai that there's a 5 minute scene where the lovers look at one another and music plays, but they don't speak.
Mhm.
And I love in opera and in musical performance the concept not of no sound and no music, but the absence of sound, or we audience members don't hear it, or
Mhm.
we audience members hear it and the characters don't hear it.
Mhm.
And so I can't wait.
Mhm.
I
Yeah,
look forward
you
to.
know, because
Yes,
there is a lot of there are moments in the opera where the characters hear the hum but the audience doesn't. There are moments when the characters are sort of just enjoying the hum, but for the audience it's this very loud feeling. So I think I'm playing with that sort of drama of, the audience having sometimes having insider knowledge to something, or not, as you say.
anything else you want to add about the listeners before I talk about the third opera of yours that I happen to love too?
Yeah, no, I would just encourage people to come to Philadelphia this fall,
Mm-hmm.
and to Chicago this spring. And it's also playing in Essen, Germany, in the second production of the show,
Mm-hmm.
um, this spring as well. So, yeah, I hope you come
Very
and see.
good. It's operaphiladelphia.org and
Yes,
it's lyric
Operaphilla,
operaphila,
PHILA dot
phila
org.
dot
Yeah,
org and lyricopera.org, I believe.
I think so. Yeah.
People can find Lyric Opera of Chicago. If you can't, just take a plane and go to Chicago.
Mhm.
Um, Another opera that came out in 2018 that I wrote the program notes for the production done at the Miller Theater in New York. I don't know if you ever saw them.
Mhm.
Um, is a rumination, let's call it, on a term that gets used a lot that I felt the opera addressed beautifully, but I don't think that there's a common understanding of the term. The American Dream. The
Mhm.
opera is called Proving Up. It's set in Nebraska. Would you tell us more about Proving Up?
Sure. So, Proving Up is based on a short story by Karen Russell, amazing American writer. All of Karen's work has a sort of magical, or I would say most of it has a sort of magical or surreal element, or an element of magical realism, where the world is mostly real, but there's sort of one sort of magical part. I think that works really well in opera. And so around 20, even before I did Breaking the Waves, this is around like 2014, 15, I had been commissioned by Washington National Opera to create something for their American Opera Initiative, which really is geared towards American stories. And I had been kicking around the idea, like really since the financial crisis, of tackling an opera about the American dream, but I had no idea what that would look like. I mean, it sounds sort of pompous and heavy-handed and dry and boring. But then I found Karen's story and I thought, oh wow, this is about the American dream. This is about the origins of the American dream and the origins of the way our country is today. And but it's very strange and very human, and it sort of has this family at its center. So Proving Up takes place in the 1860s in the wake of the Homestead Act of 1862, which stated that settlers of the West, I mean, there were already people living throughout America. I'll get to that. But, people who moved from the East to quote unquote settle the West were offered the titles to their land if they met a certain number of requirements as stated by the Homestead Act. So you had to have a certain number of crops, a certain number of acres. You had to be on your land for 5 years. You had to have a house, a structure that denoted permanence. and you had to have a window in your house, a glass window. So um, and then if you, periodically the land inspector would come out, and if you met all these requirements, you would get the title to your land. And the idea of making a stake to your claim, that phrase comes about, because settlers would go out there and literally hammer a stake into the ground, and that would sort of claim it for them. So, so this piece follows the fictional Zegner family, a mother and father and two boys, who are living out in Nebraska. They've fulfilled all the requirements for the Homestead Act. They even have a window, and they're just kind of waiting for the land inspector to come around. And what communities would do in that time is they would share windows between them. So when the land inspector came, they'd be like, "This is our window," and then someone would surreptitiously like ride it to the next homestead and be like, "This is our window," so that the whole community could could get their land titles. So it takes place on the eve. This family has sending their youngest son out to deliver this window to their neighbors so they can all sort of prove up. And this family has endured a lot of hardship. There are two dead daughters who have died out there in Nebraska, and they're in the opera, so they appear as these ghosts who are sort of running around throughout the whole piece. And so this child, Miles, the youngest son, goes out to deliver this window, but spoiler alert, he never makes it to the other homestead. He is stopped on the way by a very mysterious man, known in the story and in the opera as the Sodbuster, who steals the window and sort of stops the opera in its tracks. So this piece sort of got at what I felt to be the core of our ideas about the American dream. The American dream to me is this idea that anyone can do anything, anyone can become anything, no matter where you're from, no matter how much money your parents have, no matter your luck. Success was something to be earned, and if you worked hard enough and just did what the government told you to do, you would succeed. And I think that's an idea that still persists. We see in America, we see success, all success is earned. And which means that we see all failure as earned as well. So I think that just to make a huge generalization, but that is at the core of this sort of lack of social services and in this country. So I think that this story addresses that in a very interesting way. Here you have a family, the Zegner family, who has done everything right, big air quotes here, and that they've done everything the government has told them to do, and yet they still fail. And whether it's bad luck or karma, or, whatever, that like I wanted to show an American family that was doing everything they were told to do and still met with a sort of disastrous fate. Because that feels very anti-American. It's not a narrative that we, not a narrative that we tell all the time. Even though even then, most of the homesteads in America failed. Only about 30% were successful. Yet we have this idea, like what I learned in school was that's how, America was born, through the intrepid homesteaders who, and everyone had a happy ending. And it's just not true on any level. And then there's the other idea that, of course, there were all these indigenous Americans already living on that land.
It was their land.
Exactly. Yeah. But so that's where the idea of like, is this villainous character, is that karma for this act, even though these settlers moving west were also struggling and were poor, what justifies what? And again, I'm not interested in having you say, okay, well, this family is bad because they took this land, or this family is good because they were just doing what they were told. It's somewhere in between. The morality is a little bit ambiguous. At the core of it is, what are we fighting over? Who owns the land? That is actually the name of the key aria in the piece is, can anyone really own the land? What makes the land yours? We put so much, these sort of white settlers put so much in stock in land ownership, and they lived and died for it. And what does that even mean? When someone's already living there, and also when it's this as arbitrary as having a pane of glass in your home. So, um, so it really gets at I think, tries to get at this opera tries to get at the reality of that this horrible chapter in our nation's history of this manifest destiny, that people were destined by God to sort of go and steal land from other people, and just shines a light on the hardship and the reality of that that situation in which poor settlers were essentially weaponized by the U.S. government to again clear the land of the people already living there so that it could be settled by white people. So that's a lot to get into 75 minutes of an opera.
Well,
But I
that was
think,
part of what was great about it, is that it was all there in 75 minutes. And the libretto never lectures and never tells the audience what to think. The
mhm,
libretto lays out the story, as you just did, and allows the audience to come, each person, to his or her own conclusions
mhm.
about it. And that's great art, because I don't want to be lectured to by a work of art, but I do want to have the work of art make me think about things in ways that perhaps I hadn't before.
Yeah. Yeah, then that's what I'm going for. And I love when people always rush out of my operas and they say, "Oh, well, but wait, what happened to this one character?" And it's like, or what does this character represent? And it's like they want an answer. And I'm like, they're like, what do you think it represented? I have my own ideas, which I'll gladly
Mhm.
share. But for example, is the sodbuster, this villain improving up? Again, is it karma? Is it an indigenous American sort of exacting their revenge? Is it fate or bad luck embodied in a ghostly form of a man? Is it another settler who's been driven mad by the requirements of the Homestead Act? Because people would go crazy. Like there was a lot of just madness on the prairie at
Mhm.
that time because it was such a difficult life. So and I think there's room for all of that. And there's room for all these interpretations. And even amongst the creative team, we had sort of different ideas about like who could this person be and what could they represent. And I like that there's room for all these interpretations and room for people to bring themselves to it.
When I was researching to do the program notes, I chanced upon the fact that the term the American dream was not coined until the late 1920s, before the economic depression, but at a time when advertising, when marketing, when consumerism was geared to have everybody have a little piece of, quote, the American dream,
Mhm.
whatever the advertiser meant that to be. And I love that when I use the term American dream to 30 different people, there are 30 different conceptions of the same thing. It's like the famous blind men and the elephant, that you touch a different part, you have a different sense of it.
Mhm.
In the musical Dreamgirls, the American dream is realized when you have a Cadillac car. That means
Mhm.
you're a part of the American dream. And I meet people from all over the world, either here in the United States or when I travel, who have a piece of the American dream in them.
Mhm.
And again, their American dream may be different from having a homestead in Nebraska. It may be to make money in New York, or to star in a movie in Hollywood,
Mhm.
or to get away from persecution of one kind or another, to be able
Mhm.
to worship or love as one wants to here. We talk a good talk on that in the U.S., but we often create obstacles to people who actually want to worship or love as they want to.
Mhm.
Um, but nonetheless, it's a massive universal theme that in this opera thought is provoked, but without
Mhm.
anyone lecturing. And
Yeah.
that to me is part of and the music is part of the beauty of the work, that you come out of there thinking and thinking and thinking and thinking. And yes, opera is entertaining, and this one certainly is, but it's also very provocative.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks for seeing that. That's what I'm really going for. And again, sort of like the listeners, where I'm telling a story about a cult, which, sounds bad. When you call something a cult, that usually doesn't end well for those people. But um, same thing with the American dream. So I'm trying to highlight this sort of, I'm not shying away from the destruction and the falsehoods and the myths around it. But there's also this, I think that I personally benefited from that idea in my life. I was raised in a working class home in Pennsylvania and had this sort of insane idea that I wanted to be a musician and wanted to be a composer. And like no one in my family played an instrument, no one in my family was musical, no one had any idea what to do. But I never questioned it. I was like, I'm not gonna be defined by what my parents did or the situation around me. Like my destiny is to travel, to live somewhere else, to like make a life that is more suited to me. So like there's that side of America too, and there are good parts of this, and obviously people are coming to this country every day to find a piece of that, whatever it means to them. So I'm not trying to sugarcoat anything. I'm not trying to take sides. I'm just trying to, as you say, provoke questions.
Do you know where in Italy your family is from?
Um, it's they fled in a sort of like they were really poor and they fled at the beginning of the 20th century after a mafia battle.
No.
So I can't talk about it. No, I'm just kidding. They were from northern Italy, like Genoa, also from Sardinia. And then but mostly Genoa, I think. We think.
Right. That was my guess. We don't hear about mafia battles in Liguria and the Italian Riviera. But the reason that was my guess is because I've lived a lot of my life in that part of Italy. And
Okay.
Mazzoli is a common surname. And the people, and as I said, I know you through your work rather than our having spoken much. Um, there's an economy of language and there's an economy of communication in Liguria, in the Italian Riviera, Genoa being the capital, that stands in profound contrast to much of the country where people are very animated and very garrulous and sociable and wonderful, wonderful things. No complaints from me. But Liguria is just a bit different. It's a bit restrained. And people are separated by mountains, by hills, it's a little region. It's very hilly. There's not much arable land. People were poor because there was not available food and they had to go out to sea
Mm.
to get their fish, to get their food. And the men who did that often died in the process.
Mm.
And as I said, we have never spoken about this, but I've always had the very strong feeling in the two operas that I know that I was in Liguria because of the settling, because of the struggles to survive, because of the sea, because of the isolation, because of the sounds of the waves and the sounds of that region, which are completely different from every other part of Italy. And maybe that's why I so strongly hook into your music, because it's the sound that I know from my life over there. I've not been for a while, but I've written books about it, and it's my spiritual heart happens to be that place. I'm a New Yorker, but that's the place I'm most me. And all right, that's to be explored another time. Do you like pesto?
I love pesto. I've
That's
never
where
been to
okay.
Genoa though. I've never actually been to northern Italy.
Aha.
So
Okay.
someday, hopefully. Yeah.
You and I are going to have to talk about that because Genoa. Wagner said that after seeing Genoa, Paris and London to him were boring.
Hmm.
It's a fascinating, contradictory place.
Hmm.
It really is very fascinating. It was the biggest seafaring place in Italy, more than Venice, even more than Naples. Um, Frank Sinatra's family was from there. It's an interesting place. Half his family were from there, and all right, that's to be explored another time. I'm going to invite you and encourage you to talk to me anytime you want about Liguria because I think I've tapped something here, and I think that I'm suddenly forgetting his name, but the wonderful modern Italian composer was from Liguria. Ha 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 ha. the one who recently completed another version of Turandot, not the one in Washington, but the one done a few years ago. So not
Mhm.
Franco Alfano, but he was Ligurian. He was Italy's leading composer. I'm
Okay.
forgetting it. I'll have to bring that up in a future talk. But many of the greatest opera singers, actors were from there. Verdi. Hey, this is what you and I will talk about for a couple of minutes, and then I know you have to go. Verdi lived in Genoa for 40 winters. And while
Okay.
Verdi loved Milan for work and he admired Venice and he found a lot in Paris that provoked his thought, he was most at home in Genoa because he said that Genoa breathed Republican freedom, Republican not in the American context, God knows, but in the sense of the Republic of Genoa, as opposed to a monarchy, as opposed to a dictatorship, that the Republic of Genoa, as embodied in this opera Simone Boccanegra, where in the first act, not the prologue, but the first act, you can hear the music of the sound of the waves of the Ligurian Sea in Come Quest'ora Bruna. Um, it was Verdi who said that this speaks to freedom, this opera and this place, like no other place that he knew. So, yeah, okay.
Eh,
We'll have pesto, which is Genoese, and we will talk about this. Missy Mazzoli, I know that you have to go. Did I leave anything out you wanted to add? Are you working on something you want to tell us about, or not yet?
Sure. I mean, I can say that I'm working actually two operas right now. Uh, an opera for the Met called Lincoln and the Bardo, an adaptation of
Mhm.
the George Saunders novel that will happen
Wonderful
at
book.
LA Opera and at the Met in 2026. And then also in 2026, I have another premiere, so two operas in 1 year, called The Galloping Cure, which is another collaboration with the writer Karen Russell, and it's a sort of retelling of a Kafka story, The Country Doctor, but set amidst the American opioid crisis.
Hmm.
And it's sort of a dark, very dark fairy tale about a fantastical man who comes to town peddling a cure for pain, and then the in the form of a carousel that the whole town is addicted to riding. Um, so um, I'm very excited about those two works, very different scales, very different topics, very different time periods, and hope that you all come.
I will, definitely.
Great.
I can see where an opera company would do that in repertory with Elisir d'Amore. We shall see.
Yeah.
But really, thank you. Thank you for your work also, because it's terrific. I have been wanting for a long time to have this conversation, and I hope it's the first of many.
Thank you so much. This was great.
Thank you, Missy Mazzoli.